and Natalie Nick, who's the senior auditor. Pleased to have everybody here. What the meeting structure tonight is going to be as follows. I'm going to go through the history of this audit and why we're here. We'll go in detail through the findings and the recommendations we've made as a result of the audit, and then I'll take a few minutes of your questions and we'll conclude at that point. I expect the whole meeting to go between 30 and 45 minutes, so thank you all for coming. This is a petition audit. In my office, we do 100 to 150 audits a year, and usually about 20 are petition audits. I believe that petition audits are the most important audits because that's a situation where the citizens of the community took the time to go around, circulate a petition, and come to us and ask for an audit. It really is a real example of democracy in action, democracy working because people ask for it. And I always feel it's important when you do a petition audit to come personally deliver the results, which is why I'm here tonight. In the case of Marshfield, 461 signatures were needed for me to have the legal authority to come in and do the audit. That's 15% of the 3,067 people who voted in the last governor's election, and we received 499 valid signatures. We audited the year ending December 31st, 2012, but of course if we found issues that were pertinent after that date, we will mention them, and a few before that date as well. But we always focus on 1 year, and that's the year 2012. We considered all of the issues that were raised by the petitioners here. You won't find all of them addressed in the audit report. We only put things in the audit report that we found to be problematic. Sometimes we found there was no issue, other times they were minor issues, and we want to focus on the major ones. But I'm sure you'll see we had a lot of findings and a lot of issues to talk about. The field work was initiated here on September 26, 2012. We finished the audit on August 3rd. We spent over 1,140 hours on the audit. There are a total of 29 findings and sub-findings. Each finding is something we think needs to be improved, and I will try to give a relatively rapid run-through, but it's a very long audit, and you'll need to read it in detail yourself. I think the focus here, though, since this is not a real good audit, and we found a lot of problems, should be constructive. I view my job as a state auditor as someone who is here to help improve the community, not to assign blame, not to take sides in battles that go on, which happen within cities and in all communities. There's always issues and different groups of people that are unhappy either with the performance of their government or with each other. I view my purpose here is to cast aside all personal animosities and simply focus on what the City of Marshfield needs to do to improve its financial performance and its responsiveness to the citizens, many of you who are here tonight. Now, I put a grading system in place when I became auditor. It had never been done before. And every entity that I audit gets either excellent, a good, a fair, or a poor. And it's kind of like an A, B, C, or a D. If you're any of you teachers in the audience, a couple of you, an A, B, C, or a D is basically what it is. And at any time anybody gets a low C, a low, fair, or a poor, we come back 90 days later and we do a follow-up audit to ensure that all of the recommendations have been implemented. And the good news here is, though we found a lot of problems and we gave the city a poor rating, which is our lowest rating, I did feel, and my staff felt, that there is an actual commitment to improve the problems that we found, to correct the problems that we found, and improve the community. So we will be back in 90 days to see if it actually happened, and we will issue a follow-up report to make sure that these recommendations have been implemented. As I said, we gave a poor rating to the city because of the number of problems that we found. We did not find any intentional misconduct other than a couple of what I call relatively small conflicts of interest. But we did find significant mismanagement of the city's funds, and I'll go over those right now. So if you look at your audit report, we have everything divided up into findings. And the first finding relates to the financial condition of the city of Marshfield. We found that the general fund for the city is in poor financial condition. We found that the Board of Aldermen was not fully aware of the bad condition because of the accounting that had occurred. But in 2008, you had a positive fund balance of over $1.3 million in your general fund. As of 2012, that had sunk to $109,000, over 90% decline in that area. Contributing to this decline was the city's park fund and its on-demand bus service, which operate at major losses. So the city is basically subsidizing those activities, but hasn't really evaluated if there's a way to stop the bleeding, because the fund value keeps going down and down, and it will eventually be insolvent unless there are corrections made to the way the money is spent. The park operating losses were $112,000 in 2012 and $219,000 in 2011. The bus operating losses were $42,000 in 2012 and $37,000 in 2011. Also contributing to the decline of the general fund where the city did not properly allocate some disbursements that impact restricted funds. So you have a general fund and you also have restricted funds. As you know, there's a transportation sales tax fund that's only supposed to be used for transportation issues. There's a water fund that's limited to operating expenses for water, a sewer fund, which of course would only be spent for sewer-related activities, and a cemetery fund that should be limited, obviously, to operating the cemetery. We found that often the city paid for some services using general fund monies, even though they really benefited the restricted fund. So one of the reasons the general fund is down, they were using general fund money for restricted fund purposes. So for example, you had audit services. You actually have audit that gets done by your outside auditor. One of our problems was many of those recommendations have not been implemented, but that auditor did work on all the funds, and yet all the money was charged to the general fund, which means it went down too far. There was $5,500 for annexation plans, but there were only documented water and sewer plans, so the city should have allocated that money to water and sewer plans, not to the general fund. Conversely, sometimes the city transferred money from restricted funds to the general fund without documenting a permissible reason or properly tracking that. So for example, there was over $208,000 transferred from the water and sewer fund to the general fund without any documentation of a permitted reason, and that's a violation of state law. There was $1.3 million transferred from the transportation sales tax fund to the general fund, but there was no tracking on how that money was spent or where it was spent. In accounting terms, it's commingling. You've heard the term. You're throwing money around, but you're not keeping track of where the money is being spent. You have restricted funds. By law, the money has to be spent there. You can't transfer it back to the general fund unless you can document a specific allowable reason under state law. And that was not happening. Because of all the transfers and unallocated expenses and the lack of documentation, it is very difficult for the board to get an accurate picture of the financial condition. And we think that's the reason that it went down from over $1.3 million all the way down to only $100,000, because the money was being transferred all over the place. And even very seasoned accountants found it very difficult to figure out where the money went. And that's why we think the general fund is in such bad condition. Our recommendations are always flow from our findings. And our recommendation is very simple. The Board of Aldermen should require accurate and timely financial reports, monitor the city's financial condition, develop a plan to repay the general fund from all the money that was taken from it for special purposes, and review city operations for efficiency. The good news is, it appears that the mayor is committed to that, and we understand that will occur. And I have to say, Mayor Carroll, are you here today? Yes. We believe that the mayor understands the seriousness of the problem and seems quite committed to fixing it, and we'll work with the mayor over the next 90 days to make sure all the proper adjustments are made, and then you'll have a better idea of the actual state of your city's finances. Closely related to finding number one, if you look in your audit report, is finding number two, which is the city lacks adequate accounting records and procedures and has not implemented prior audit recommendations from your own outside auditors. So I was talking about fiscal responsibility, but let's talk more specifically about these restricted monies. Instead of having separate bank accounts for each of the dozen or so restricted funds, the city actually puts all the money together into what's called a pooled cash fund. Now that's not against state law, that's allowed, but when you use a pooled cash fund, there has to be very, very careful documentation of when money is taken out and what it's used for, and we found that was lacking. The city does not did not separately track and consider the availability of money in each account. If you look on page 8, you can see some of the funds have a positive balance, some have a negative balance, and there was really no effort to reconcile why they're positive, why they're negative, why money was taken out of some account, and why money was put into another account. I'll give you a couple of examples. Some of the funds have negative balances. The city used $9,797 of sidewalk project fund monies to pay an engineer for the I-44 interchange study. Well, there's a separate fund for the I-44 interchange study. That's where the money should have come from. Again, using restricted funds for improper purposes. The city paid credited $237,000 of state motor vehicle related receipts to the general fund, but that money by law has to go to the transportation sales tax fund. So, and we have, I'm going to give you just two examples, I could be here all night, but there were many, many examples of the funds not going to the proper purpose. And they're well documented and they're in the audit, and I think our auditors were able to basically figure out what went on, but it took a long time, and it'll take a while to get it all put back in place. You also have an independent auditor that's made many recommendations over the past few years, and the city has not implemented those, and I'm understanding we're committed to doing that as well. Adjustments. Accountants regularly make journal entries to record receipts and disbursements to an accounting system. They make adjustments. So for example, if you have money in the bank and an interest payment comes in, you've got to make a little adjustment to your journal entries. Sometimes somebody sends a bad check and you've got to make an adjustment. Transfers between funds require adjustments on your accounting books. But those shouldn't happen that often, just for a few specified purposes. What we found here was a large number. In 3 months in 2012, the city accountant, who I understand is not here anymore, is that correct? Made 51 adjustments for $1.6 million. That suggests a lot of the data was not going in correctly to begin with, because that's an unusually large, highly unusually large number of adjustments. So our recommendation flows from the finding that you should ensure restricted monies are used only for allowable purposes, which was not happening, that the accounting records accurately reflect the financial activity, that audit recommendations from your regular auditor, I only come in every now and then, are implemented, and there's an independent review and approval of adjustments. When there's $1.6 million worth of adjustments made, there needs to be a second set of eyes looking and finding out why is that happening, why are there so many mistakes being made that all those adjustments have to occur. Wanted to talk a little bit now about the next finding, number 3 in your audit report, which is real estate. I'm going to make a long finding short. There's a not-for-profit, a very worthy organization that you all support here in the city, but over the years you've bought 3 or 4 parcels of land from them. Sometimes they've sat there empty for years. Other times there was arrangements made to use them, but it seemed odd to us that in one case, $24,000 was paid for a piece of property without even an appraisal. It sat there vacant for a long time. I understand that's now been resolved, but when you do land transactions, they can really result in a drain on the finances because you've got to keep up that property. And if you're going to buy property for a specific purpose, we like to see the transaction consummated quickly and not have multiple parcels of land being bought for one purpose and no one deciding what to do with it, and then end up draining the city of a significant amount of money. And that's true not only for this one not-for-profit, but we found other situations where the city owned property that it was not making good use of. Our recommendation is very simple. Develop plans for utilizing city-owned property, consider the costs of holding that land, and conduct cost-benefit analyses when leasing properties. And I understand the city has agreed to this recommendation and is in the process of implementing it. Let's talk about number 4, budgets and financial statements. There is a state law on municipalities and cities what they have to have in their budgets, and that's designed for citizens like you so you can understand what the budget is. So there's no hidden data. And the city budgets are supposed to have what's called a budget message, which states their overall purpose, a budget summary. Of course, you have to have actual beginning and ending balances, what you expect, what you have at the beginning of the year, what you expect to have at the end of the year, fund balances between the different funds, and you know you have many restricted funds, we talked about that earlier, indebtedness, and other things like that. The basic information that a citizen, maybe a non-accountant citizen, would be able to look at and see, well, what's the condition of my city? We found that there were significant problems with almost none of those items being in the city budget until recently. And that way you don't have any transparency or any opportunity to look into what's going on in your city. And as a result, even members of the Board of Aldermen didn't really know what the budget situation was. We found, for example, that disbursements exceeded budgeted amounts in 2012, and there was an adjustment made to allow another $170,000 worth of payments to be made, and even then, you came in $50,000 missing in your budget, $50,000 over budget. So that was problematic. The city also did not correctly record budget information to the accounting system, so budget to actuals were not precise. So you have what the budget is for each month, you have what the actual expenditures are, you're supposed to be able to compare the two. Your city was not able to do that because the data that was entered was not proper and not properly entered. So again, what we want is something very simple. Comply with the state law requirements on budgeting so that people can understand what's going on with the city's finances. And again, the city, I think, has already implemented that this year, and my understanding is that's already been corrected, but we'll come back in 90 days to be sure. But I can tell you in the past there were serious deficiencies in the way the budgets were put together and the way they were presented to the public. Also, state law requires the publication of semi-annual financial statements, which did not occur. We understand that will occur right now. Number 5, accounting controls and procedures. Very basic issue. The city does not always issue receipt slips for monies received or use pre-numbered receipt slips or restrictively endorse checks or document the method of payment. So if you're out there and you got to make a payment to the city, you're supposed to get a receipt. And those receipts are supposed to be in numerical order, because what we want to do when we come in and audit is see if they're missing one. Well, if they're not issued numerical order, we can't tell if they're missing one, and we don't know if something improper occurred. And so this is very basic accounting. That was not occurring. But again, my understanding is that's occurring now, and it will occur in the future. Business licenses and building permits. The city does not use pre-numbered business licenses and permits, and did not reconcile business licenses and permits to fees collected and deposited. So you go out and get a permit to open a building or something like that, you're supposed to get a numbered receipt, and then we're supposed to be able to come in and see where that money went and that it was properly accounted for. We were not able to do that. So I'll give you just a couple of examples, and these are just by way of example, not a complete list by any means. The city charged $750 for 6 of the 13 water tap-in permits sold in 2012, but the law says it's $700 in the municipal code, and in some cases, the city clerk only charged half of that. So again, we need to make sure that what you all say are the fees actually are the fees. Sometimes it's too high, sometimes it's too low. Park fees and refunds. The city invoices for renting parking facilities that are not adequately or prepared timely. 6 of the 8 invoices from May to October 2012 contained mathematical errors, causing the city to undercharge renters. Again, simple math needs to be improved. The city paid $2,200 for refunds for overpayments between June and October, but didn't refund about $1,500 of it until many, many months later. So there was also untimely refunds that occurred. Our recommendations, again, they always flow pretty naturally from the finding that we had. Issue pre-numbered receipt slips for all monies received, document the method of payment, restrictively endorse checks, and make intact, timely deposits. Again, I learned from the mayor and others that it's going to happen. Hopefully it is happening at this point. So that's very, very good. Number 6, payroll controls and procedures. During the period of time we audited, the city accountant's payroll duties were not segregated, and there was no documented supervisory review. Now, we did not find any stolen money. I want to say that very directly. However, since I've been state auditor around the state for only 2.5 years, I found 21 instances of public officials embezzling taxpayer money. And often that was because there was no segregation of duties. Only one person had control of all the money, so if somebody was taking it, there was no way to figure it out. And then we come in, and sometimes, in one case, it's been going on for 10 years, and the clerk had stolen $568,000 because there was no supervisory review. Now, we did not find that here, and I want to make that very clear, but the opportunity for that did exist because there was no second set of eyes looking at the transactions, and I think that's very, very important. There was no one conducting a review at the time we did the audit of the city accountant's time and leave records. She was paid her normal salary for 80 hours worked for a pay period in which she only worked 70 hours. And we found employees and supervisors don't sign timesheets and time cards. We looked, for example, at the documentation of some of the city employees. The audit staff here reviewed documentation for 7 sewer department employees, just 7, and found 22 errors in vacation leave balances, 9 errors in sick leave balances, and 26 errors in compensatory leave balances. That's a lot of errors. And that's because there wasn't a second set of eyes checking the math to make sure that the numbers were accurate. We also found a few issues with the police department not submitting time records to the city accountant, which we think should happen, although we had no indication that impropriety there. Personnel policies. The city manual doesn't address a lot of personnel policies, when people can leave, when they can't. That needs to be cleaned up. And some people were allowed to accrue compensatory time in excess of the amount allowed in the manual. So we hope that will also be corrected. Our recommendation is, segregate the payroll duties, ensure there's a documented review, make sure timesheets are properly prepared, signed, approved, and reviewed. Number 7, written contracts and contract compliance. Now, this is actually a fairly common finding, but it was worse here than in a lot of places. The city does not have written contracts with some service providers and needs to do better contract monitoring. So there's a statute, a law in Missouri, Section 43270, which says all contracts for political subdivisions have to be in writing. If you all make contracts for cars and for home repair, and you get it in writing. We found the city entered into oral agreements for $39,000 for information technology, $20,000 for audit services, $15,000 for veterinary services, $10,000 for cleaning services, $5,000 for accounting services. None of those contracts were in writing. By law, under the state, those contracts have to be in writing, and future. We expect they will be. My understanding is that they will be. We found the city paid the Chamber of Commerce $13,000 in 2012 based on an informal agreement to operate a convention and visitors bureau, but there's a city ordinance that require that to be in writing as well. Similarly, there's some interesting issues in the audit about the relationship between the Marshfield Fire Protection District and the City of Marshfield Fire Department. We don't have any problem with those arrangements, but they were not properly documented, so you all could see what the arrangements were. We also found the city paid $50,000 for a comprehensive plan, which is for zoning and physical development. We think, long-term planning is a very good idea from an audit perspective, so having this plan is great. The problem was the city engaged a vendor in 2008. I know some of you know about this. I guess with some of the complaints we received. They terminated the contract after paying $14,000, engaged a second contractor, paid them $36,000, which is actually above the contract price. And then the city was notified that the first vendor had acquired the second vendor, and so we were back to square one. And as of December 2012, the document was incomplete, and you'd spent about $50,000 on it. So it's a great idea to have a plan, but it's not such a good idea to spend $50,000 and not have a plan. And that's what our concern was in that particular situation. We also found a number of other situations where contracts were not properly monitored. There was several that are mentioned in the report, and my understanding is that the mayor is working on those and going to correct those problems as well. So our recommendation, again, it's not real complicated, is get your agreements in writing and make sure when people are contracted to perform a service, they actually perform it, and if they're not performing, terminate them and get your money back if you can. Finding number 8 in your audit report relates to disbursements. We found some weaknesses in the controls and procedures over disbursements or expenditures. The list of bills the board approves each month was not complete. No one compared the list to approved invoices and the checks actually written. It's basic accounting that needs to be done. The board did not review the closing of bank accounts or bank account transfers. In 4 months, the city accountant closed 5 bank accounts with over $300,000 in them, deposited the funds in the pooled cash account without any board approval. Literally, there was a $300,000 transaction occurred, and no member of the board was aware of it. Obviously, that has to change. In another case, over 6 months, the city accountant made 30 online banking transfers, totaling $420,000 without any supervisory review or any approval. There were also lack of approval of some invoices prior to payment and some purchase orders before purchase. We have a section 8.2 in the audit which talks about fuel and usage records. Suffice it to say, I won't go through the details of the finding, but fuel can be a very big cost for cities. People have cars, and there was not adequate tracking of fuel usage either. And there's another place where people can abuse the system. We find this all over the state. They take a little extra gas for themselves. And you need to have really, especially in these days of high oil prices, you need to have really careful controls. That's a really good place for abuse, is in fuel. In March 2012, we actually found that the city accountant had inflated the price per gallon charged to the city from $3.19 per gallon, which was the actual price, to $5.81 per gallon. And there was a similar inflation for diesel in order to account for the fact that 145 gallons were missing. So we don't know what happened to 145 gallons, and the answer was not, let's figure out what happened to 145 gallons. Let's just raise the price of what we did have to equal it out so it looks like nothing's missing. That is very shady accounting. That's close to intentional misconduct, as we found in this audit, and that was highly problematic to us. You don't adjust the books to reflect the reality. You want the books to be accurate in and of themselves and not adjust them when you find a problem. We also found a couple of conflicts of interest. These were not what I would call huge conflicts of interest, which I've found in other audits I've done. But there were situations where people were on the board and were able to vote on matters that affected them, and that's not permissible. There was one situation where somebody approved a contract with their cousin. In my case, I have conflicts of interest as auditor. A simple recusal letter. When the contract's about to be let, when decisions are made, you put a letter in the file. I'm going to withdraw. I'm not going to be involved in this decision. That's all you have to do. The city also does not always comply with its own bidding policy. The city policy requires for goods or services more than $5,000 they have to advertise and solicit written bids, and then there are lesser requirements for smaller contracts. We found that the city could not document bidding for several purchases, $60,000 in accounting software, $39,000 in information technology, $29,000 for auditing services. No bidding, no competition. Competition That's what our country is about, brings lower prices. And there are circumstances in which you don't have to compete. Usually there's an emergency. So for example, this building flooded and you need to move quick, you get somebody in here quick. And we don't look for, you don't want to have a competition and wait weeks while the place gets wet. But you have to have a very specific reason for not competing something out. And we found very large contracts where there appeared to be no sort of emergency where there was not competition. So we're hoping that that will occur in the future. There also were there were some sole source procurements that had bad documentation as well, including handheld meters, concrete, and fire department radios. Also, once you let the contract, this is about letting out the contract. Once you let out the contract, you have to make sure that people are justified in being paid. So you have a contract, it's a valid contract, it's a good contract, now you're going to start to pay. You've got to retain documentation supporting the fact that these people deserve to be paid, because it's taxpayer money involved here. We found the city had not retained documentation to support amounts paid to various vendors, including $23,000 paid to a software company, $4,000 paid to an electrical contractor, and $2,500 paid to a veterinary clinic. Now, they might have been very valid expenditures, but we want to see something in the file saying, why did we pay these people? What did they do? And we didn't see that. We also found there was not adequate grant documentation for some of the grants that the city received as well. And we also found that there were some of the payments that were due to the vendors that were not paid in a timely manner. Vendor information. We always look, when we go into a city, of who are the people you have contracts with? Who are your vendors? And we found that there was 18 duplicate vendor names. So the same company was twice on the vendor list. And at least in one case, and we do sampling, we don't look at everything. At least in one case, the same vendor was paid twice for the same services. And that's because they were on there twice, and therefore they got paid twice. So obviously, there was a slight difference in the spelling, which is why they were on there twice. And that happens pretty frequently. But you all got charged twice for the same service. It wasn't a lot of money, but that's the kind of thing that could really be a problem down the road, especially if you have a dishonest vendor and they take advantage of that fact. So we want to see the board receiving a complete list of bills, appropriate reviews and approvals, and maintaining records so there's no conflicts of interest and proper recusals if somebody does have a conflict of interest, solicit bids, and make sure that when people are paid, there's documentation that they did the work that required the payment. Computer controls and procedures, that's finding number 9 in your audit. What we found, I'm going to make a long story short here, but basically a lot of people could log into one person's computer using the same password. And sometimes people could log in and make edits or adjustments to other people's work without having their own password. So the computer security was very poor, and we have several documented instances you can read about in the audit. But the bottom line is, I mean, where you work, I'm sure you have your password in your computer, and you don't hand it out to other people so they can come in when you're not around and mess with your stuff. And that's what was happening here. We don't want to see that. So we want to see that improved. Finding number 10, utility controls and procedures. The city did not perform monthly reconciliations of total amounts billed, payments received, and amounts unpaid for utility services in 2012. Water, for example. The city did not investigate significant differences between gallons of water billed to customers versus gallons of water pumped. This is a very common thing. You hear about it with gas, it happens with water. People siphon off water and they get it for free. Normally, when I come to a city, if I see more than 10% of the water unaccounted for, somebody's stealing the water, okay? You expect leaks in the pipes and things like that, and there's going to be some unaccounted for water. That's natural. But we know about what it should be in a city, and here it was higher, and it wasn't carefully reconciled. We don't know what happened to it, but we do know that, for example, in March, 4.1 million gallons were not accounted for. That's 27% of the water pumped could not be accounted for. And anything over 10% is problematic for us. That month it was 27%. I would guess somebody was stealing your water. We can't prove it, but that's a very large amount of water runoff. Or the other possibility is there was a huge underground break of some kind and no one found it. So either way, a lot of money was wasted and a lot of water was not properly billed. There also was a number of issues of people who actually do refunds from the water department, didn't get them. We document that in there too. There was overpayments and underpayments, and they were not properly accounted for. And they didn't pursue the people who needed to pay, and they didn't refund the people who needed money back, who were entitled by law to get money back. So we're looking for more careful investigation of discrepancies in water. It can cost a lot of money. and you kind of take water for granted, but we see this around the state where a lot of municipalities lose a lot of money because they're not carefully tracking their water usage. Finding number 11 in the audit is capital asset and insurance procedures. We found the city lacks procedure to identify capital asset purchases and dispositions of the basically inventory, where things go. The city does not tag property, does not conduct an annual physical inventory for items in City Hall, and city property records are not complete and up to date, and they don't have proper insurance coverage on what they do have. Now, in the old days, inventory for a city was like this podium, and it's very unlikely that somebody's going to walk off with a podium. But you know what inventory is today? It's electronic equipment. It's things that people can steal and make good use of. So we have, as a state auditor's office, become much more attentive to inventory than we used to. We always used to ding people for not having tags on their tables and their chairs. Well, now, I did the audit of the Kansas City schools. There was $4 million of missing electronic equipment that couldn't figure out where it was. Now they put a little computer chip in there to track it so they can find out who stole it. So inventory is more important than ever, and we hope the city will tighten up its inventory controls to reflect the reality of inventory today. There's a lot of good stuff that people like to steal. That is a quick summary of what I found in the audit. As you can see, there's a lot more in there. But basically, we have a situation here where the financial condition, the accounting controls, the real